The Kethvar hunting grounds stretched endlessly beneath the crimson canopy of Xerian Prime's ancient forests. Here, among trees that had stood for millennia before the first starship ever touched the soil, the young of the galaxy's most feared predator species learned the sacred art of the hunt. The massive feline-like beings, each standing nearly 3 meters tall even in their adolescent forms, moved through the undergrowth with practiced silence. Their amber eyes gleamed with predatory intelligence, their retractable claws occasionally scraping against bark as they navigated the terrain their ancestors had mastered eons ago. Zara Th, eldest of the current training group, flicked her ears irritably as she caught another scent that didn't belong. For 3 days now, the strange smell had lingered at the edges of their hunting grounds, sweet and alien, carrying undertones that made her hackles rise instinctively. The other cubs had noticed it too, though none dared speak of it during their lessons with Elder Vorgon. To admit awareness of something the Elder hadn't acknowledged would be seen as disrespectful, questioning his authority in matters of the hunt. The training session had been particularly challenging today. Elder Vorgon had set them the task of tracking a shadow deer through the dense underbrush without disturbing so much as a leaf. The creature was known for its incredible sensitivity to even the slightest disturbance, able to detect the approach of a predator from hundreds of meters away. It was considered the ultimate test of a young Kethvar's developing skills. Most cubs required several attempts before they could even approach within striking distance. Zara Th had been closing in on her target, muscles coiled and ready to spring when the scent hit her again. Stronger this time, accompanied by something else that made her freeze mid-step. The soft sound of breathing that wasn't quite right. Too quick, too shallow, carrying a rhythm that spoke of a much smaller creature than any that should be capable of moving so silently through their domain. She turned her massive head slowly, golden eyes scanning the forest floor around her. At first, she saw nothing unusual. The same twisted roots and fallen logs that had always provided cover for their prey. The same patches of dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Then, between the gnarled roots of an ancient ironbark tree, she caught a glimpse of something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was small, impossibly small for something that had managed to penetrate so deep into Kethvar territory undetected. No larger than her own paw, with strange pale fur covering most of its body and bizarre flat features that seemed more like a carved mask than a living face. But what truly shocked her was the way it moved. Not with the desperate scurrying of prey, not with the cautious stalking of a fellow predator, but with a fluid grace that seemed to flow around obstacles rather than navigate them. The creature appeared to be tracking the same shadow deer she had been pursuing. It moved with its body held low to the ground, using every bit of available cover with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Most remarkable of all, it seemed completely unaware of her presence, despite the fact that she was downwind and should have been easily detectable to any creature with functional senses. Zara Th found herself torn between her hunting instincts and her curiosity. Every fiber of her being told her to strike, to eliminate this strange intruder that had somehow violated the sanctity of their training grounds. But something else held her back. Perhaps it was the creature's obvious youth, evident in the slightly uncoordinated way it occasionally stumbled over larger obstacles. Or perhaps it was the sheer audacity of something so small attempting to hunt in territory that belonged to the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. She settled back on her haunches and watched, fascinated despite herself. The creature had positioned itself remarkably well, using a fallen log as cover while maintaining a clear line of sight to the shadow deer's likely path. Its tiny hands gripped what appeared to be a primitive projectile weapon, though one crafted with surprising sophistication. The construction was elegant in its simplicity, utilizing principles of leverage and stored energy that spoke of an advanced understanding of physics despite the apparently primitive materials. The shadow deer emerged from behind a cluster of thorn bushes, its iridescent coat shimmering as it moved through patches of filtered sunlight. The creature was magnificent, its movements liquid and graceful as it picked its way delicately through the undergrowth. Zara Th had been hunting shadow deer for months now, and had never managed to get closer than 50 meters before the creature's supernatural senses detected her presence, and it vanished like smoke into the forest. The small intruder remained perfectly still, so motionless that Zara Th began to wonder if it had somehow frozen in place. Not even the slightest tremor of muscle or shift in position betrayed its presence. The shadow deer continued its approach, completely unaware of the danger that waited mere meters away. When the shot came, it was so unexpected that Zarath nearly gave away her own position with a startled grunt. The projectile flew true, striking the shadow deer with precision that would have impressed even Elder Vorgon. But what happened next defied everything she thought she knew about hunting. Instead of the killing blow she expected, the projectile seemed to merely graze the creature's flank. The shadow deer stumbled, regained its footing, then took several more steps before collapsing gently to the forest floor. No blood, no violence, no struggle. The creature simply laid down as if it had decided to take a nap. The small hunter emerged from concealment and approached its quarry with the same fluid grace it had displayed during the stalk. Zarath watched in amazement as it checked the shadow deer carefully, running tiny hands along its neck and checking its breathing. After a moment, it produced a small device from somewhere within its coverings and held it near the creature's head. A soft clicking sound echoed through the forest, barely audible even to Zarath's enhanced hearing. The shadow deer's eyes fluttered open, and it raised its head groggily. The small hunter backed away slowly, maintaining a respectful distance as the creature struggled to its feet. After a moment of apparent confusion, the shadow deer bounded away into the forest, apparently unharmed. Zarath stared in absolute bewilderment. In all her training, in all the legends passed down through generations of Kethvar hunters, she had never heard of such a thing. Hunting without killing, tracking without consuming, demonstrating mastery over prey only to release it unharmed. The concept was so foreign to her understanding of the natural order that she struggled to process what she had just witnessed. The small creature had begun to clean its weapon, breaking it down into component parts with practiced efficiency. Its movements were calm and methodical, betraying no signs of the adrenaline rush that should follow such a successful hunt. If anything, it seemed almost bored, as if what it had just accomplished was routine rather than the impossible feat Zarath knew it to be. She found herself rising to her feet, drawn by a curiosity stronger than her caution. The soft rustle of her movement should have been inaudible to most creatures, but the small hunter's head snapped up immediately, its strange pale eyes scanning the forest around it with obvious alarm. For a moment, their gazes met across the undergrowth, and Zarath saw something in those alien features that she recognized despite their vast differences. Intelligence. Not the simple cunning of a successful predator, but the kind of deep, analytical thinking that her own people prized above all else. The creature was evaluating her, measuring her threat level, calculating its options with a speed that impressed her despite herself. She remained perfectly still, curious to see what it would do. Flee? Attempt to hide? Prepare for combat despite the obvious futility of such an action? Instead, the creature did something that surprised her yet again. It sat down, not in a position of submission or defeat, but in a relaxed posture that seemed to invite conversation. One tiny hand remained near its weapon, Zarath noticed, but the gesture seemed more practical than threatening. The creature was prepared to defend itself if necessary, but it was also willing to attempt communication. Intrigued, Zarath began to approach slowly, using the same careful movement she employed when stalking prey. The creature watched her advance without apparent fear, though its body language remained alert and ready for immediate action. When she had closed the distance to perhaps 10 meters, she lowered herself to the ground in the traditional Kethvar gesture of peaceful intent. The creature tilted its head slightly, studying her posture with obvious interest. Then, to her amazement, it mimicked the gesture as best it could with its radically different anatomy. The attempt was clumsy and inexact, but the intent was clear. It understood that she was attempting to communicate peaceful intentions, and it was responding in kind. They remained like that for several long minutes, studying each other across the forest floor. Zarath found herself fascinated by the creature's features, so unlike anything she had encountered before. The pale fur that covered its body seemed soft and fine, unlike the coarse pelts of the creatures that inhabited this region. Its limbs were long and slender, clearly adapted for fine manipulation rather than raw strength. Most intriguing of all were its eyes, which held a depth of awareness that spoke of a rich inner life despite the creature's obvious youth. Finally, the small being made a gesture toward the area where the shadow deer had fallen. It pointed to itself, then to the spot, then made a series of hand movements that seemed to be attempting to convey information about what had occurred. The communication was primitive, but Zara-TH found herself beginning to understand. It was trying to explain its hunting technique. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This tiny creature, this impossible being that had somehow infiltrated the most dangerous territory in the known galaxy, was offering to teach her something about hunting. The sheer audacity of it should have been insulting, yet she found herself genuinely curious about what it might have to show her. She gestured for it to continue, using movements she hoped would convey her interest despite their lack of a common language. The creature seemed to understand, rising to its feet with obvious excitement. It moved back toward the area where it had taken a shot, gesturing for her to follow. What followed was the most remarkable demonstration Zara-TH had ever witnessed. Using a combination of gestures, crude drawings scratched in the dirt, and careful positioning of forest debris, the creature began to explain its approach to hunting. Not just the mechanics of the stalk and the shot, but the entire philosophy behind what it had done. The projectile, it seemed, had been coated with a substance that induced temporary unconsciousness rather than death. The creature demonstrated this by showing her a small vial containing a pale liquid, carefully extracted from some kind of plant matter. The weapon itself was designed not for maximum damage, but for precise delivery of specific dose calculated to incapacitate without causing permanent harm. But the truly revolutionary concept was the purpose behind such an approach. Through its careful explanations, Zara-TH began to understand that the creature hunted not for food or territory, but for knowledge. Each successful stalk provided information about the prey's behavior, movement patterns, and capabilities. By avoiding the need to kill, the creature could study the same individual animals over extended periods, building up a comprehensive understanding of their habits and psychology. It was a form of hunting that prioritized learning over conquest, understanding over dominance. The idea was so foreign to everything Zara-TH had been taught that it took considerable effort for her to grasp its implications. Yet as the creature continued its explanation, she began to see the brilliance of the approach. By studying prey alive rather than simply killing it, one could learn not just how to track and kill more effectively, but how to predict behavior, how to understand the complex relationships between different species, how to see the forest as a living system rather than simply a collection of potential targets. The creature had finished its explanation and was watching her with obvious hope, clearly eager to see if she had understood. Zara-TH found herself nodding slowly, her mind racing with the possibilities. This was knowledge that could revolutionize not just her own hunting abilities, but the entire approach of her people to the natural world around them. She looked at the small being with new respect. Whatever species it belonged to, wherever it had come from, it possessed wisdom that could benefit even the greatest hunters of the Kethvar. The question was whether her people would be willing to listen to teachings from such an unlikely source. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Elder Vorgon was returning, probably to check on her progress with the shadow deer. In moments, he would discover not only that she had failed in her assigned task, but that she had been consorting with an alien intruder in their most sacred hunting grounds. The creature seemed to understand the danger immediately. It began gathering its equipment with swift, economical movements, preparing to disappear back into the forest. But before it could leave, Zara-TH made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. She placed one massive paw gently in front of the creature, blocking its path. When it looked up at her in confusion, she gestured toward a dense thicket nearby, then pointed to herself and nodded. The message was clear: stay hidden, and she would handle the approaching elder. The creature hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between self-preservation and some kind of trust in her intentions. Then it nodded and slipped silently into the undergrowth, vanishing so completely that even Zara-TH's enhanced senses could barely detect its presence. Elder Vorgon emerged from the trees just as she was settling back into position, weapon raised, and focused on the area where the shadow deer had been. His amber eyes swept the clearing, taking in every detail with the thoroughness of a master hunter. "I heard a disturbance," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of experience. "What transpired here, young one?" Zaratich chose her words carefully. "I was closing in on a shadow deer, elder. It detected my presence at the last moment and fled. I am still learning to mask my approach effectively." Vorgon nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her explanation. He sniffed the air carefully, his sensitive nose cataloging every scent in the immediate area. Zaratich held her breath, hoping that the creature's alien smell wouldn't be detectable over the more familiar forest odors. After what felt like an eternity, the elder gestured for her to continue her hunt. "The day is not yet over, young one. There will be other opportunities. Remember, patience is the greatest virtue of a true hunter." As Vorgon disappeared back into the forest, Zaratich let out a quiet sigh of relief. The creature emerged from its hiding place moments later, its strange features showing what she was beginning to recognize as gratitude. It offered her a small object, carved from some kind of dark wood, and shaped into an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and flow even as she watched. She accepted the gift carefully, understanding that it represented something important in the creature's culture. In return, she used one claw to carefully etch a symbol into the bark of a nearby tree. It was the traditional Kethvar mark indicating a successful hunt, but with a subtle modification that would be recognized only by another member of her species as indicating that the prey had been released unharmed. The creature studied the symbol with obvious interest, then carefully copied it into its own small notebook using a primitive writing implement. The exchange complete, they both understood that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. As the small being prepared to depart, it made one final gesture. It pointed to the same spot where they now stood, then to the sky above, making a circular motion with its hands. The meaning was clear. It would return at the same time tomorrow, if she wished to continue learning. Zaratich nodded emphatically, already eager for the next lesson. As she watched the creature disappear into the forest with the same impossible silence it had demonstrated all afternoon, she realized that her understanding of hunting, of the natural world, and perhaps of intelligence itself, was about to be fundamentally changed. The small being moved through the undergrowth like flowing water, leaving no trace of its passage despite the density of the terrain. In moments, it was gone, leaving only the lingering scent and the memory of impossible skills demonstrated by an even more impossible teacher. Tomorrow, she decided she would bring the other cubs. If this strange creature was truly willing to share its knowledge, then perhaps the entire next generation of Kethvar hunters could benefit from its wisdom. The thought filled her with excitement and anticipation unlike anything she had ever experienced. The forest around her seemed somehow different now, alive with possibilities she had never imagined. Every shadow held potential for discovery. Every sound carried new meaning. The small creature had opened her eyes to an entirely new way of seeing the world, and she knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers as Zaratich led her fellow cubs through the familiar paths of their hunting grounds. Beside her walked Carvin, her closest companion among the trainees, his massive frame moving with the characteristic silent grace all Kethvar learned from birth. Behind them followed Thanese and Jorith, the youngest of their group, their amber eyes bright with curiosity about the mysterious summons Zaratich had issued before dawn. She had told them little, only that she had discovered something in the deep forest that would revolutionize their understanding of the hunt. The others had agreed to follow her primarily out of friendship and trust, though she could sense their growing skepticism as they moved deeper into territory they rarely explored during their regular training sessions. Zaratich, Carvin finally spoke, his deep voice barely above a whisper despite their distance from the main training grounds. "You have been acting strangely since yesterday's lesson. Elder Vorgon mentioned that you seemed distracted during the afternoon hunt. What is this great discovery you claim to have made?" She paused in her movements, considering how much to reveal. The truth was so extraordinary that she doubted they would believe her without seeing it for themselves. Yet she needed to prepare them somehow for what they were about to witness, if the strange creature kept its implied promise to return. "Tell me," she said carefully, "what is the ultimate goal of our hunting training?" Thanese answered immediately, reciting the traditional response they had all learned as children. "To become perfect predators, capable of taking any prey through superior skill and strength." "And what defines a successful hunt?" The swift and efficient elimination of the target, Jorith added, his young voice carrying the certainty of unquestioned teaching. Zaratich nodded slowly. Those are the answers we have always been given. But what if there were other ways to define success? Other methods that could make us not just better killers, but better hunters? The others exchanged glances that she recognized as concern for her mental state. Carvin moved closer, his expression troubled. Zaratich, you speak as if there could be alternatives to the teachings of our ancestors. The methods of the Kethvar have been perfected over millennia. We are acknowledged throughout the galaxy as the supreme predators. What could possibly improve upon such mastery? Before she could answer, a soft rustling in the undergrowth ahead caused all 4 cubs to freeze instantly. Their heads turned as one toward the source of the sound, ears pricked forward, muscles coiling in preparation for immediate action. For a moment, the forest was absolutely silent except for the gentle whisper of wind through the canopy above. Then, the small creature emerged from behind the same ironbark tree where Zaratich had first glimpsed it the day before. The other cub's reaction was immediate and instinctive. Carvin's claws extended with a soft snick, his lips pulling back to reveal gleaming fangs. Fainesse dropped into a hunting crouch, her powerful hindquarters bunching for a lethal pounce. Jorith simply stared in shock, his young mind struggling to process the appearance of something so utterly alien to his experience. Hold, Zaratich commanded, placing herself between her companions and the small being. This is what I brought you here to see. The creature is not our enemy. What is that thing? Fainesse hissed, her voice tight with barely controlled hunting instincts. It reeks of alien chemistry, and its form is unlike anything in our databases. How did something so obviously weak manage to penetrate our territory undetected? The small creature had stopped its approach the moment it sensed the other cub's hostile intentions. It now stood perfectly still, hands held slightly away from its body in a gesture Zaratich was beginning to recognize as its species' version of non-threatening behavior. Despite the obvious danger it faced, its strange pale eyes showed no fear, only alert caution and what might have been disappointment. Yesterday, Zaratich began carefully. I observed this being successfully stalk and capture a shadow deer using techniques unlike anything we have ever been taught. Not only did it approach closer than any of us have ever managed, but it accomplished something even more remarkable. She gestured toward the area where the demonstration had taken place. It released the prey unharmed after studying it closely. The creature hunts not to kill, but to learn. The concept was so foreign that her companions simply stared at her in confusion. Carvin was the first to find his voice. Release the prey? But that makes no sense. What purpose could such an action serve? How does one demonstrate mastery without conquest? The small being seemed to understand that it was being discussed, though the specific words were clearly beyond its comprehension. It reached slowly into its coverings and withdrew the same primitive weapons Zaratich had observed the previous day. With careful, non-threatening movements, it began to disassemble the device, laying out its components on a fallen log where all 4 cubs could examine them. It wishes to demonstrate, Zaratich explained, moving closer to the makeshift display. Yesterday, it showed me how each part of its hunting method serves a different purpose than our traditional techniques. Reluctantly, driven by curiosity despite their suspicions, the other cubs began to approach. Jorith was the first to move, his youthful inquisitiveness overcoming his caution. He sniffed delicately at the weapon components, his sensitive nose analyzing their chemical composition. These materials are organic, he reported, surprise evident in his voice. Plant fibers woven together with remarkable precision. The craftsmanship is sophisticated despite the primitive appearance. But I detect no metal components, no power sources, no chemical accelerants. How could such a device be effective against prey as alert as shadow deer? The creature began to reassemble its weapon, its small hands moving with practiced efficiency. As it worked, it gestured for the cubs to observe each step of the process. The construction was indeed elegant in its simplicity, utilizing principles of stored mechanical energy and precise engineering to achieve remarkable power and accuracy despite its apparent primitiveness. When the weapon was complete, the being began a series of movements that were clearly meant to simulate a hunting scenario. It dropped to the ground and began to demonstrate the stalking techniques Zara-TH had witnessed the day before. The fluidity of its movement was even more impressive when viewed alongside the cub's own considerable skills. Where a Kethvar hunter might use raw strength and speed to overcome obstacles, the small creature seemed to flow around them like water finding its path down a hillside. Impossible, Thanes breathed, her amber eyes wide with amazement. Look at its spine flexibility, the way it distributes its weight. It's using principles we've never considered. The demonstration continued as the creature showed them how it had positioned itself for the shot, how it had calculated wind resistance and target movement, how it had delivered the projectile with surgical precision. But the most remarkable part came when it produced the small vial containing the sleep-inducing substance it had used to incapacitate rather than kill its target. Carvin examined the container carefully, his nostrils flaring as he analyzed the scent of its contents. "This is derived from native plants," he reported, "but processed in a way I've never encountered. The chemical signature suggests a compound that would induce rapid unconsciousness without permanent harm. But how did it know which plants to use? How did it learn to refine them so precisely?" The creature seemed to understand the question, though again the specific words were beyond its grasp. It pointed to itself, then to various plants around the clearing, making careful gestures that seemed to indicate observation and testing over extended periods. Then, it drew in the dirt what appeared to be symbols representing different plant types, with notations that might have indicated their various properties. "It's been studying our ecosystem," Zara-TH realized aloud. "Not just the animals, but the entire biological network. It understands relationships between species that we've never even considered." The implications were staggering. Traditional Kethvar hunting focused almost exclusively on the predator-prey relationship, with little consideration for the broader environmental context. The idea that one could gain hunting advantages by understanding plant chemistry, weather patterns, and the complex interactions between different species had simply never occurred to any of them. The small being began another demonstration, this time showing them how it had tracked the shadow deer's approach. Its methods were radically different from Kethvar techniques, relying on subtle environmental cues rather than direct sensory observation. It showed them how to read the direction and age of footprints by examining the way grass bent around them, how to determine an animal's emotional state from the chemical traces it left behind, how to predict movement patterns by understanding feeding behaviors and territorial instincts. Each revelation built upon the last, creating a comprehensive picture of hunting that was simultaneously more complex and more elegant than anything they had been taught. Where traditional Kethvar methods relied on superior physical capabilities to overcome prey through direct confrontation, this creature's approach was based on superior knowledge used to achieve objectives with minimal effort and maximum precision. "This is revolutionary," Jorith said, his young voice filled with awe. "If these techniques could be integrated with our natural advantages, we could become hunters beyond anything our ancestors ever imagined." But even as the cubs marveled at the demonstration, Zara-TH noticed something troubling. The small creature's movements had become increasingly labored as the morning progressed. Its breathing was more rapid than it had been the day before, and she could detect what her sensitive nose identified as stress markers in its scent. Something was wrong. Her concerns were validated when the being suddenly staggered and sat down heavily on the fallen log. Its pale features had taken on a grayish tinge, and its hands trembled slightly as it attempted to continue its explanations. The other cubs noticed the change immediately, their predatory instincts alerting them to the signs of weakness, even as their newly awakened curiosity made them concerned for their unusual teacher. "It's sick," Thanes observed, moving closer with careful steps. "The chemical signatures indicate severe stress, possible malnutrition, and something else. Something that suggests its presence here is not entirely voluntary." The creature seemed to understand their concern, though it attempted to wave off their worried attention. It pointed to the sky, then made gestures indicating the passage of time, as if trying to explain that its condition was temporary and related to some kind of schedule or obligation. But Carvin's enhanced hearing had caught something the others missed. In the distance, barely audible even to Kethvar senses, came the sound of approaching engines. Not the familiar hum of their own people's aircraft, but something else. Something with a harsh, mechanical roar that spoke of less sophisticated but more numerous technology. The small creature heard it too, its alien features showing immediate alarm. It began gathering its equipment with frantic haste, clearly preparing to flee despite its obvious physical distress. But before it could complete its preparations, the source of the sounds became visible through the forest canopy above. Ships, dozens of them, flying in tight formation patterns that spoke of military organization. Their hulls were scarred and weaponized, bristling with the kind of heavy armament used for ground assault rather than space combat. As the cubs watched in growing horror, several of the vessels broke formation and began descending toward their location. Raiders, Jorith whispered, using the term they had all learned to describe the violent nomadic fleets that occasionally attacked settled worlds. But what are they doing in Kethvar space? Our territory is heavily defended. The small creature had stopped its packing and was now staring up at the approaching ships with an expression of resignation mixed with something that might have been grief. It said something in its own language, words that carried emotional overtones, even though their meaning was incomprehensible to Kethvar ears. Then, to their amazement, it began removing more items from its coverings. Not weapons or tools, but what appeared to be personal effects. Small carved objects, pieces of fabric with intricate patterns, and what looked like primitive data storage devices. It arranged these items carefully on the ground, then stepped back and gestured toward them while looking directly at Zaratish. The meaning was clear. It was entrusting these possessions to her care, believing that it would not survive whatever was about to happen. The sound of the engines had grown much louder, and now they could hear other noises as well. Shouting voices, the crash of heavy equipment being unloaded, the distinctive whine of energy weapons powering up. Whatever force had arrived was large, well-armed, and clearly not interested in peaceful contact. "We have to get out of here," Carvin said urgently. "If these are raiders, we need to reach the emergency beacons and summon help. The elders must be warned." But even as he spoke, they all realized the futility of such action. The ships had landed between them and the main settlement, cutting off their most direct route home. Worse, the creatures deploying from those ships were moving with a kind of organized efficiency that suggested extensive familiarity with the terrain. This was not a random raid, but a carefully planned operation. The small being was watching their discussion with obvious understanding, despite the language barrier. It pointed to itself, then to the approaching sounds, and made a gesture that clearly indicated surrender. Then it pointed to the cubs and made shooing motions, try to convince them to flee while they still could. "It's trying to protect us," Thanes realized with amazement. "This creature, whatever it is willing to sacrifice itself to give us time to escape." The nobility of the gesture struck all four cubs simultaneously. Here was a being they had known for mere hours, whose very existence had challenged everything they thought they understood about intelligence and hunting. Yet it was prepared to face certain capture or death rather than allow them to come to harm. Zaratish made a decision that would define not only the rest of her life, but the future relationship between their species and the strange creature's people. She picked up the items the being had arranged on the ground and secured them carefully in her own equipment pouches. Then she moved to the creature's side and placed one massive paw gently, but firmly on its shoulder. "No," she said, using the universal gesture for negation that seemed to translate across species barriers. "We stay together." The other cubs looked at her in shock, but after a moment of consideration, they moved to flank the small being as well. Whatever was coming, they would face it as a group. The strange teacher had shown them more in a few hours than they had learned in months of traditional training. The least they could do was ensure its continued survival to share that knowledge with others. The sounds of the approaching force had grown very close now. Through the trees, they could see flashes of movement as heavily armed figures deployed through the forest. Their equipment was crude, but effective, their movements speaking of extensive combat experience. Most troubling of all, they seemed to know exactly where to look, as if they had been tracking the small creature specifically. "Bounty hunters," the being said suddenly, speaking its first recognizable word in the cub's language. The pronunciation was heavily accented and clearly difficult for its alien vocal cords, but the meaning was unmistakable. The implications hit them like a physical blow. The creature was not just a random traveler who had stumbled into their territory. It was a fugitive pursued by professional hunters who had tracked it across space to this remote world. The question was why, and whether the cubs' decision to protect it would make them targets as well. They were about to find out. The first of the hunters had emerged from the tree line, weapons raised and ready. Behind them came others, spreading out in a classic encirclement pattern that would prevent any possibility of escape. At their head walked a figure that made even the brave Kethvar cubs take an involuntary step backward. It was humanoid in basic shape, but clearly heavily modified with cybernetic enhancements. One arm had been replaced entirely with a mechanical limb that terminated in multiple weapon systems. Its face was a patchwork of organic flesh and artificial components, dominated by sensor arrays that glowed with malevolent red light. When it spoke, its voice was a harsh mechanical rasp that seemed to scrape against their sensitive hearing. "Found you at last, little human," it said, its words carrying the casual cruelty of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Did you really think you could hide from us forever?" Human. So that was what the small creature was called. Zara-Th filed the information away, even as her mind raced to process the implications of everything she was witnessing. Somehow, this human child had escaped from these bounty hunters and fled to Kethvar space. Whether by accident or design, it had sought refuge in the most dangerous hunting grounds in the galaxy, perhaps hoping that even professional trackers would be reluctant to pursue it into such territory. The human child straightened despite its obvious fear and physical distress. When it spoke, its voice was clear and steady, showing a courage that impressed even the naturally brave Kethvar cubs. "I'm not going back," it said simply. "You'll have to kill me first." The cyborg laughed, a sound like grinding metal that made them all wince. "Oh, we're not taking you back alive, little one. Dead or alive, the bounty is the same. But our employers want you to understand why you're dying before we finish this." It gestured to its companions, who began advancing with weapons raised. The message was clear. The conversation was over, and the execution was about to begin. That was when Zara-Th stepped forward, placing herself squarely between the hunters and their intended target. Her massive form dwarfed even the cyborg, and the sight of her fully extended claws and bared fangs caused several of the approaching figures to hesitate. "You are trespassing on Kethvar territory," she announced, her voice carrying all the authority of her species' fearsome reputation. "Leave now, or face the consequences." The cyborg's mechanical features twisted into what might have been a smile. "And what exactly do you think you can do about it, kitten? You're just children playing at being hunters. Stand aside, or we'll add your pelts to our trophy collection." Behind Zara-Th, her three companions had also moved into protective positions around the human child. For adolescent Kethvar might not be a match for a full squad of professional bounty hunters, but they would not go down easily. And their sacrifice would buy time for the human to escape, assuming it had the sense to run when the fighting started. The human, however, seemed to have other ideas. It stepped forward, placing itself beside Zara-Th despite the obvious danger. When it spoke, its words were directed not to the hunters, but to the cubs who had chosen to protect it. "Now, I'll teach you Stillhunting," it said quietly, its voice carrying a confidence that seemed impossible given their circumstances. The cubs must hold their breath and watch carefully. This lesson could save all our lives. What followed would become the stuff of legend among the Kethvar for generations to come. The human child's words hung in the air like a promise of impossible things. Stillhunting. The term was unfamiliar to the Kethvar cubs, but the way the small being said, it carried implications that made their enhanced senses tingle with anticipation. Around them, the bounty hunters continued their advance, weapons powered and ready, confident in their overwhelming advantage in numbers and firepower. Zara-Th felt the human's hand touch her massive foreleg, a contact so gentle she almost missed it. But with that touch came something unexpected, a vibration barely perceptible, rhythmic, and purposeful. The child was communicating through touch, using patterns that bypassed the need for shared language. The message was simple but urgent. Remain absolutely still, make no sound, and trust. The cyborg leader had raised his mechanical arm, weapon systems cycling through their initialization sequence with soft electronic whines. "Last chance, kittens. Step aside, or become collateral damage. The choice is yours." That was when the forest around them began to change. At first, The transformation was so subtle that even the HFY cubs' enhanced senses barely detected it. A slight shift in the quality of light filtering through the canopy above. A gentle alteration in the pattern of shadows cast by the ancient trees. The almost inaudible whisper of movement in the undergrowth, so faint it might have been imagination. But the human child stood perfectly motionless in the center of it all, eyes closed, breathing slow and controlled. Its entire body had taken on a stillness so complete that it seemed to fade slightly, becoming less distinct despite the fact that it hadn't moved a single step from where it stood. The bounty hunters noticed nothing. Their attention was focused entirely on the obvious threats, for large predators with extended claws and bared fangs. Their sensors were designed to detect weapons, energy signatures, and hostile movement. They were not programmed to notice the subtle environmental changes that the human's presence was somehow orchestrating. Carvin was the first of the cubs to understand what was happening. His acute hearing picked up sounds that didn't quite make sense. The soft rustle of leaves moving against the wind pattern, the faint scrape of bark against bark from trees that should have been stationary, the almost subliminal whisper of small creatures moving through the undergrowth with far more coordination than nature typically allowed. The human was not just hiding. It was conducting. Like some impossible maestro, it was orchestrating the entire forest around them, turning their environment into something that would soon become a weapon against their attackers. Faint SA caught the scent next. Among the familiar odors of forest loam and growing things came traces of something else. Plant chemicals that should not have been present in such concentrations, carried on air currents that seemed to flow in defiance of the morning breeze. The aromas were subtle, but unmistakable to her sensitive nose, the same compounds the human had used to incapacitate the shadow deer, now beginning to permeate the air around the clearing. But this was different from the simple projectile demonstration they had witnessed earlier. This was the same technique scaled up to an impossible degree, utilizing the entire ecosystem as a delivery system. Somehow, the human had prepared for this confrontation, seeding the area with plants that could be triggered to release their soporific compounds when stimulated in the right way. Jorith, youngest of the group, but possessed of perhaps the keenest intuitive understanding, was the first to notice the wildlife. Small creatures that should have fled the moment the armed hunters entered their territory were instead moving closer. Not the random scurrying of panicked animals, but coordinated movement with clear purpose. Insects, birds, small mammals, even reptiles that normally avoided each other's company, all converging on the clearing with unnatural unity. The human had done something that the cubs' minds struggled to comprehend. It had somehow communicated with the native fauna, enlisting them as allies in the coming confrontation. The idea was so foreign to HFY understanding that it took considerable mental effort to accept what their senses were telling them. The cyborg leader had finished his weapon initialization and was preparing to fire when the first phase of the human's plan came to fruition. A cloud of tiny insects, barely visible to the naked eye, descended on the bounty hunters like a living mist. Their stings were individually insignificant, but their venom carried the same sleep-inducing compounds that the human had refined from native plants. Several of the hunters swatted at the swarm with confused irritation, assuming they had simply stumbled into a nest of local pests. But within moments, their movements began to slow noticeably. Weapons wavered in suddenly unsteady grips. Voices became slurred as they called out warnings to their companions. The cyborg's enhanced systems provided some protection, his mechanical components immune to biological agents. But even he seemed momentarily confused by the coordinated nature of the attack. "Defensive formation," he barked, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. "Something's wrong here. The local fauna is acting abnormally." That was when the second phase began. The trees themselves seemed to come alive around the hunters. Branches that had been motionless in the still morning air began to sway and bend, not with the random motion of wind, but with deliberate, coordinated purpose. Vines that had been draped innocuously over the forest floor suddenly writhed upward, wrapping around ankles and weapons with uncanny accuracy. The human had somehow triggered a response from the plant life itself. Whether through pheromones, chemical signals, or some form of communication the cubs didn't understand, it had enlisted the forest as an active participant in their defense. Hunters found themselves entangled by vegetation that seemed to grow before their eyes. Weapons were pulled from their grasp by branches that moved with impossible precision. Those who tried to cut themselves free discovered that their energy weapons had little effect on plant matter that had been chemically treated to resist burning. But the most remarkable aspect of the entire display was how the human managed to exclude the HFY cubs from the effects. Despite standing in the center of the chaos, they remained untouched by both the soporific insects and the aggressive plant life. Somehow, the child had marked them as allies in whatever communication system it was using to coordinate the assault. Impossible, the cyborg snarled, his mechanical arms cycling through different weapon configurations as he searched for something effective against their unusual attackers. This is coordinated resistance. The little human has somehow turned the entire ecosystem against us. His analysis was correct, though his understanding of the implications was limited. What they were witnessing was not just an impressive display of environmental manipulation, but a completely revolutionary approach to combat. Instead of meeting superior firepower with superior firepower, the human was using knowledge and preparation to turn the environment itself into an overwhelming force multiplier. By the time the third phase of the attack began, half the hunter squad was down. Some had succumbed to the cumulative effects of the insect venom. Others were too entangled in aggressive vegetation to continue fighting effectively. Those still standing found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't identify, couldn't target, and couldn't effectively counterattack. The third phase was perhaps the most elegant of all. Small animals began emerging from the undergrowth, moving with obvious purpose towards specific targets among the hunters. Squirrels with pouches full of concentrated plant toxins. Birds carrying seed pods that exploded into clouds of blinding spores when they struck their targets. Even insects that seemed to have been specifically trained to target the electronic components of the hunter's equipment. Each attack was precisely calibrated, designed not to kill, but to incapacitate and disarm. The human was applying the same philosophy it had demonstrated with the shadow deer, but on a scale that encompassed an entire ecosystem. Victory through superior knowledge and preparation rather than superior violence. The cyborg leader, his enhanced systems still functioning despite the biological assault, had finally identified the real threat. His mechanical eye focused on the human child, who remained motionless in the center of the chaos, eyes still closed, breathing still controlled. Clever, he admitted, raising his weapon arm toward the small figure. But biological weapons have limitations. My systems are hardened against organic attack, and at this range, even coordinated animals can't stop a direct energy discharge. The weapon began to charge with a high-pitched whine that cut through the sounds of the ongoing battle. Around them, his remaining squad members continued to struggle against their living attackers, but the cyborg shot would end the conflict regardless. Once the human conductor was eliminated, the coordinated resistance would collapse. That was when Zara-TH understood the final lesson the human was trying to teach them. The child had never intended to face the hunters alone. The environmental manipulation, impressive as it was only the opening movement of a larger composition. The true purpose of the demonstration was to show the cubs how traditional hunting techniques could be integrated with the human's knowledge-based approach to create something entirely new. She moved with all the speed and power her species was famous for, but with a precision and purpose she had never achieved before. Instead of the direct assault that HFY training emphasized, she used the chaos around her as cover, flowing between the struggling figures like the human had flowed between obstacles during its stalking demonstration. The cyborg's enhanced reflexes detected her movement, but too late. His weapon was designed for precision targeting, not the kind of close-quarters combat that Zara-TH now brought to bear. Her claws found the junction points where his mechanical arm met organic tissue, precisely severing the connections that allowed his cybernetic systems to function. The weapon arm fell to the forest floor with a crash of metal and sparking electronics. The cyborg leader staggered backward, his organic features showing shock and pain as severed nerve connections sent confused signals through his hybrid nervous system. But even as Zara-TH disabled their leader, her three companions were putting their own newly learned lessons to use. Carvin used the human's flow-like movement principles to navigate through the entangled vegetation, striking at hunters who were too confused and disoriented to mount effective resistance. Fein SA employed the environmental awareness techniques they had been shown, using scent, and sound to locate targets that were hidden behind screens of aggressive plant life. Jorith, perhaps most remarkably, seemed to have grasped some aspect of the human's communication with local wildlife. Small creatures were actually responding to his gestures, providing him with information about hunter positions and weapon status. The partnership was crude compared to what the human had achieved, but it was functional enough to give him a decisive advantage in the ongoing conflict. The battle was over within minutes. The surviving hunters found themselves disarmed, entangled, and at the mercy of 4 young predators whose capabilities had somehow expanded far beyond anything their intelligence reports had suggested. The cyborg leader, his primary weapon systems destroyed and his squad neutralized, finally understood that he had underestimated not just the human child, but the learning capacity of its unlikely protectors. "Surrender," Zara-TH said, her voice carrying new authority born from successfully integrating traditional Kethvar strength with revolutionary new tactics. "You are outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and completely outmatched. Yield, and you will be treated according to the laws of honorable combat." The cyborg looked around at his fallen squad, then at the 4 young Kethvar who had somehow defeated a force that should have overwhelmed them with ease. His mechanical features showed something that might have been respect alongside his obvious defeat. "I yield," he said finally, powering down his remaining weapon systems. "But I demand to know, what are you? You fought like Kethvar, but with tactics I've never encountered from your species. How did children accomplish what veteran warriors should have found impossible?" The human child finally opened its eyes and stepped forward, its small form somehow commanding attention despite its obvious physical exhaustion. The environmental manipulation was clearly taking a toll, but its voice remained steady as it addressed the defeated hunter. "They learned," it said simply. "They watched, they listened, and they adapted. That's what intelligence really means. Not just the ability to apply overwhelming force, but the wisdom to find better ways." The cyborgs remaining organic, I studied the human with obvious fascination. "You're not just a runaway slave, are you? You're something much more dangerous. You're a teacher." "I'm a child," the human replied. "But yes, I'm also a teacher. And now these cubs know what they need to know to protect themselves and others like me." The implications of that statement hung heavy in the forest air. The human hadn't just been fleeing from the bounty hunters. It had been leading them into a trap, using its capture as bait to demonstrate something crucial to the Kethvar cubs. The entire encounter had been a lesson disguised as a battle, teaching the next generation of galactic predators that there were alternatives to the traditional approaches they had always known. As the cubs began securing their prisoners and tending to their wounds, Zara-TH found herself looking at the human child with new understanding. This small being represented something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that had developed intelligence as its primary survival trait, refining it to a degree that could make even the most physically powerful predators obsolete if they couldn't adapt. But rather than using that advantage to dominate or exploit others, the human had chosen to share its knowledge with those willing to learn. It was offering partnership instead of conquest, cooperation instead of subjugation. The question now was whether the Kethvar as a people would be wise enough to accept what was being offered, or whether they would see the humans' teaching as a threat to their traditional way of life. The cubs had proven that integration was possible, but convincing the elders would require more than a single demonstration, no matter how impressive. As the morning sun climbed higher through the forest canopy, illuminating the aftermath of their unprecedented victory, Zara-TH realized that their adventures were just beginning. The human child had kept its promise to return, but in doing so, it had fundamentally changed the trajectory of their lives. From now on, there would be something new in galactic history. Kethvar who had learned to hunt with their minds as well as their bodies. Predators who understood that true mastery came not from strength alone, but from the wisdom to know when strength wasn't the answer. The forest around them was already returning to normal as the humans' influence faded. Plants resumed their natural positions. Animals dispersed back to their normal habitats, and the careful balance of the ecosystem reasserted itself. But the knowledge that such coordination was possible remained, a permanent gift that would reshape how the cubs understood their place in the natural order. As they began the journey back to their settlement with their prisoners in tow, each of the 4 young Kethvar carried within them the seeds of a revolution that would eventually transform their entire species' relationship with the galaxy around them. The human child walked beside them, no longer a mysterious intruder, but a valued teacher whose lessons had proven their worth in the most dramatic way possible. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, combining the traditional strengths of the Kethvar with the innovative wisdom of their unlikely human instructor. The forest whispered its approval as they passed, and in that whisper, those who knew how to listen could hear the sound of the future being born. The Great Hall of the Kethvar Council had witnessed many momentous occasions throughout its thousand-year history, but none quite like the scene unfolding within its ancient stone walls. Elder Vorgon stood before the assembled leadership, his massive frame dwarfed by the ceremonial architecture that rose in the shadows above. Behind him, bound but unharmed, the captured bounty hunters waited under heavy guard. And beside them all, looking impossibly small and fragile in the vast space, stood the human child whose presence had triggered the most significant debate in recent Kethvar history. The Council of Elders occupied their traditional positions in a great semicircle, their amber eyes reflecting the light from braziers that had burned continuously since the founding of their civilization. At their center sat High Elder Magthara, her ancient features bearing the accumulated wisdom of nearly 2 centuries of life. Her gaze moved slowly from the prisoners to the human, then to the 4 cubs who had requested this unprecedented assembly. "Let me ensure I understand the claims being made," she said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute command. 4 untrained cubs managed to defeat a squad of professional bounty hunters using techniques learned from this creature in the span of 2 days. Zaratich stepped forward, her head held high despite the magnitude of the audience before her. "Yes, High Elder." The human demonstrated hunting methods that integrate environmental knowledge with traditional skills in ways we had never imagined possible. The victory was achieved through superior tactics, not superior force. Elder Gokran, known for his traditional views and skepticism of innovation, leaned forward in his massive stone chair. "You speak of techniques as if they were formal training, yet this being is clearly a child. How can something so young, so obviously weak, possess knowledge that our centuries of refinement have not discovered?" The human child stepped forward before any of the cubs could answer. Despite the obvious intimidation factor being surrounded by dozens of massive predators, its voice remained steady and clear. "Honored elders," it said, using the formal address that Zarth had taught it during their journey to the settlement. "Your hunting methods are indeed highly refined, perfected over many generations for maximum effectiveness within their intended scope. But they were developed for a specific type of prey and a particular approach to conflict. My people faced different challenges that required different solutions." High Elder Magthara studied the small figure with obvious interest. "Explain these challenges, young one. Help us understand how your different solutions could possibly improve upon techniques that have made us the supreme predators of the galaxy." What followed was perhaps the most comprehensive presentation of human survival philosophy ever delivered to a non-human audience. The child spoke for nearly an hour, describing how humanity had evolved not as apex predators, but as persistence hunters who relied on intelligence, cooperation, and environmental manipulation to overcome physically superior prey. "My ancestors," the human explained, "were small and weak compared to most of the creatures they hunted. They couldn't outrun their prey, couldn't overpower it through direct confrontation, and lacked the natural weapons that made other predators successful. So they developed something else, the ability to think several moves ahead, to turn the environment itself into an ally, and to coordinate their efforts in ways that multiplied their individual capabilities." Elder Torvash, whose expertise lay in military strategy, was the first to grasp the implications. "You're describing a completely different paradigm of conflict. Instead of meeting strength with strength, you're advocating the use of superior positioning and preparation to make strength irrelevant." "Exactly," the human confirmed. "But it goes beyond just military applications. The same principles apply to any situation where you need to achieve objectives despite facing superior opposition. Resource management, environmental adaptation, even social cooperation can all be enhanced using these techniques." To demonstrate its points, the human had brought samples of the equipment it had constructed during its time in the forest. Each item was examined by the elders with growing amazement. Simple tools that achieved remarkable effectiveness through elegant engineering. Compounds derived from local plants that could incapacitate without causing permanent harm. communication devices that allowed coordination with local wildlife through chemical and acoustic signals. But perhaps most impressive of all was a detailed map the human had created of the local ecosystem. Not just the geographic features that traditional HFY cartography recorded, but a comprehensive analysis of the relationships between different species, seasonal migration patterns, resource distribution cycles, and environmental factors that affected behavior. This represents more detailed knowledge of our own territory than many of our elders possess, admitted Elder HFY, whose responsibilities included environmental management. How did you acquire such comprehensive understanding in such a short time? Observation, experimentation, and systematic analysis, the human replied. But most importantly, I approach your ecosystem without preconceptions about how it should work. I watched what actually happened rather than assuming I knew what would happen based on previous experience with different environments. The captured cyborg leader, who had been silent throughout most of the proceedings, finally spoke up. Honored elders, if I may be permitted to address the council, I have some information that may be relevant to your deliberations. High Elder Macthra gestured for him to continue, though her expression made it clear that his words would be carefully evaluated. This human is not unique, he said, his mechanical voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. My employers have been tracking several dozen individuals of this species across multiple star systems. They represent something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that has developed space travel capability without developing any significant physical advantages over their planet-bound ancestors. He gestured toward the human child with his remaining organic arm. Most species that achieve interstellar travel do so by becoming apex predators on their homeworld first. They develop superior strength, speed, natural weapons, or some combination thereof. Humans achieve the same result through pure intelligence and cooperation. They're physically weaker than almost every other spacefaring species, but they consistently outperform expectations through superior tactics and adaptability. Elder Gokran's expression showed obvious skepticism. If they're so superior tactically, how do they end up as slaves to be hunted by bounty hunters? The cyborg's mechanical features showed what might have been regret. They didn't. The humans were never slaves. They were researchers sent by their government to study various ecosystems throughout the galaxy. My employers wanted their knowledge, but the humans refused to share it voluntarily. So we were hired to capture specimens for interrogation. The implications of this revelation sent a wave of disturbed growling through the assembled elders. The attack on their territory hadn't been a simple pursuit of escaped slaves, but an act of aggression against peaceful researchers under the protection of HFY sovereignty. You're telling us, High Elder Macthra said, her voice dangerous with controlled anger, that your employers ordered an armed invasion of our territory to kidnap scientists who were conducting legitimate research. Yes, honored elder. And, if I may add, the humans' research was specifically focused on developing techniques for peaceful coexistence with apex predator species. They weren't trying to exploit or conquer anything. They were trying to find ways for different types of intelligence to work together for mutual benefit. The human child nodded confirmation. My assignment was to study HFY hunting techniques and see if there were ways our different approaches could complement each other. The ecological research was part of that mission. I was trying to understand your relationship with your environment so I could propose areas of potential cooperation. Elder Vorgon, who had remained silent throughout most of the discussion, finally spoke. This explains much about what I observed during the cub's training. The creature, the human, never showed any signs of predatory behavior toward our prey animals. Its interests seemed genuinely focused on understanding rather than exploitation. Zara-Th stepped forward again. Honored elders, I request permission to demonstrate the techniques the human has taught us. Not through combat, but through a controlled hunting exercise that will show how these methods can enhance rather than replace our traditional skills. After a brief consultation among themselves, the elders agreed. A formal hunt was arranged for the following day, with the 4 cubs working as a coordinated team to track and capture a shadow deer using the integrated techniques they had learned. The entire council would observe, along with selected instructors and senior students from the various hunting schools. The demonstration that followed would become legendary among the HFY for generations to come. Working together with a human as their coordinator, the 4 cubs achieved something that had never been accomplished before. the capture of a shadow deer without causing it any harm, followed by detailed behavioral observations conducted while the creature remained conscious and alert. The key was the integration of traditional HFY physical capabilities with human-developed tactical approaches. Instead of relying solely on stealth and speed, the team used environmental manipulation to create controlled circumstances where the prey's natural behavior could be studied in detail. Carvin used his strength to modify the terrain in subtle ways, creating pathways that would guide the shadow deer's movement without alarming it. Thanes employed her enhanced senses to gather detailed information about the creature's emotional state and physical condition throughout the encounter. Jorith coordinated with local wildlife to create a network of observers that provided real-time intelligence about the deer's location and intentions. And Zarth served as the overall tactical coordinator, integrating information from all sources to predict the deer's behavior and position the team for maximum effectiveness with minimum disturbance. The human's role was primarily advisory, providing suggestions and adjustments as the situation developed. But its most important contribution was demonstrating how to maintain the kind of systematic, analytical mindset that allowed the cubs to see patterns and opportunities that pure instinct might miss. When the shadow deer was finally captured, it was done with such gentleness that the creature seemed more curious than frightened. The behavioral observations that followed revealed aspects of shadow deer psychology that had never been documented before, including complex social signals and environmental responses that could be used to predict migration patterns and feeding behaviors. After the deer was released unharmed, the assembled observers spent hours discussing the implications of what they had witnessed. The demonstration had proven that human techniques could indeed enhance HFY capabilities without compromising their essential nature. More importantly, it showed that cooperation between different types of intelligence could produce results that neither could achieve alone. High Elder Makthara was the first to speak when the formal evaluation session began. What we have witnessed today challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of hunting, intelligence, and cooperation between species. These methods offer possibilities we had never considered. But it was Elder Gokran's reaction that carried the most weight. As the most traditional member of the council, his approval would be crucial for any changes to be accepted by the broader HFY community. I confess that I began this evaluation expecting to dismiss these human techniques as inferior alternatives to our proven methods, he said slowly. Instead, I find myself wondering how many opportunities we may have missed by limiting ourselves to a single approach to hunting and environmental interaction. He turned to address the human child directly. Young one, your people's willingness to share this knowledge despite the treatment you have received from others in the galaxy speaks well of your character. But I must ask, what do you and your people hope to gain from this exchange? Surely you don't expect us to believe you offer such valuable information without expecting something in return. The human's answer would prove to be the most important moment in the development of interspecies relations in that sector of the galaxy. Honored Elder, it said, my people believe that intelligence is most effective when it's shared and multiplied rather than hoarded and isolated. Every species we've encountered has developed unique approaches to the challenges they face. By sharing our techniques with you and learning from your techniques in return, both our peoples become more adaptable and more capable. But there's something more important than practical benefits. Throughout the galaxy, there's a tendency to assume that different species must inevitably come into conflict because they compete for the same resources or territory. We think that's a false assumption based on limited thinking. Different types of intelligence can find ways to cooperate that benefit everyone involved if they're willing to invest the time and effort required to develop mutual understanding. The human gestured toward the 4 cubs who had participated in the demonstration. Zarth and her companions proved today that HFY and humans can work together to achieve things that neither could accomplish alone. If our species can establish that kind of cooperation, it becomes the model for other species to follow. Instead of a galaxy divided by suspicion and competition, we could have a galaxy united by shared knowledge and mutual benefit. The vision the human described was so far beyond anything the HFY had previously considered that it took considerable time for its implications to be fully understood. But as the elders discussed the possibilities, a new understanding began to emerge. The human child represented not just an individual seeking refuge, but the advanced representative of a completely different approach to galactic civilization. One based on cooperation rather than domination, on shared knowledge rather than hoarded advantages, on the belief that intelligence was most powerful when it was used to lift everyone up rather than to maintain hierarchical divisions. As the council session drew to a close, High Elder Macthra made a decision that would reshape the future of both species. The council recognizes the human child as an honored guest and respected teacher. Furthermore, we formally request that its people consider establishing a permanent cultural and scientific exchange program with the Kethvar. We have much to learn from each other, and even more to gain by working together. The humans' response would have to wait for the return of its people's ships, but the foundation had been laid for something unprecedented in galactic history, a true partnership between two fundamentally different approaches to intelligence and survival. As the various participants dispersed to spread word of what had transpired, the four cubs found themselves at the center of a transformation that would echo throughout Kethvar society for generations to come. They had begun the day as students learning about hunting techniques. They ended it as pioneers in a new form of interspecies cooperation that would change the galaxy forever. 3 months after the Council's historic decision, the Kethvar homeworld experienced something unprecedented in its recorded history: the arrival of a human diplomatic mission. The sleek vessels that descended through the crimson atmosphere bore little resemblance to the crude ships that had brought the bounty hunters. The human had shown her that intelligence could be something far more powerful, a force for transformation that could reshape not just individual capabilities, but entire civilizations. The human child had spent the morning preparing for the reunion with obvious excitement, but also with a certain sadness at leaving behind the friends who had become like siblings during its stay among the Kethvar. The connection forged during those first dangerous days in the forest had deepened into something that transcended species boundaries, proving that bonds of affection and respect could develop between any forms of intelligent life willing to invest the emotional energy required. Elder Vorgon emerged from the lead vessel, his massive frame moving with newfound confidence and purpose. The past months had transformed him as much as anyone, as he had worked closely with the human to develop new training methodologies for the hunting schools. The integration of human analytical techniques with traditional Kethvar wisdom had produced teaching methods that were revolutionizing how young members of their species learned to interact with their environment. Behind him came High Elder Macthra and several other members of the council, all eager to meet the humans who had sent such a remarkable ambassador. The formal greetings would be conducted according to carefully negotiated protocols that respected both species' cultural traditions while establishing the foundation for ongoing cooperation. But Zara TH's attention was focused on the figures emerging from the human vessels. Adults of the same species as the child, but bearing the unmistakable marks of maturity and experience. They moved with the same fluid grace that had first attracted her attention in the forest, but with an added confidence that spoke of extensive knowledge and capability. The lead human was a female with graying hair and features that bore the accumulated wisdom of considerable experience. She wore simple clothing that emphasized function over ornamentation, and her eyes held the same analytical intelligence that had made the child such an effective teacher. When she spoke, her voice carried authority temper,